Uh, I took the wrong flight. No, obviously with my Afghanistan background and trying to always understand the way in which outsiders try and assist insiders, whether it be in development or security, I was automatically interested in the Ukraine. And I guess there's an additional dimension to this, and that is fundamentally, and we'll speak about this today, is that the world is not isolated. We don't sit in Africa and say that's not our business. It's somebody else's business. It's a European conflict, just as we don't want people to stay away from assisting us in Africa. And Ukraine also has tremendous impacts for African economies, given its exports to Africa of basic foodstuffs. And whatever happens in Ukraine, of course, it affects Europe. And Europe has a disproportionate influence on African economies from a trade and investment standpoint, among others, and also in terms of aid. So, conflict today is part of a global system. And if we don't settle this conflict quickly and stop this war, the impacts are going to be long and likely very destructive. And Africa will probably bear a significant and disproportionate burden because of our dependency on external food supplies and because of our relatively poor social circumstances, and people don't have the sort of depth of cushion of a safety net that they do in other parts of the world. So my initial instinct back in February, I'd arranged a trip some time ago on the back of my Afghanistan experience to go to Ukraine. I arrived on the 23rd of February, and of course woke up on my way to get to Kyiv with the news of the war had broken out. So my first attempt was foiled. I spent my time down on the border, and then I came back about a month ago and produced a short movie based mostly in Western Ukraine, and now I'm back this time, and I'm looking out over the city of Kyiv, about to settle for the areas which are more contested. So it certainly adds to the understanding of what we can do as the international community to put pressure on people to end this conflict, because, as I say, it has a disproportionate influence on Africa, but an influence on the global economy as a whole.
Great. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I know that your time is limited. So for those of you just joining, we are with Dr. Greg Mills, the director of the Brenthurst Foundation. I know many of you are joining from around Africa. You're hosted by I2. Myself and Dale Sutton-Price are here in the I2 offices while we've zoomed Greg in from the Ukraine. Maybe we woke him up and he suddenly realized he was going to be on a call with some 600 Africans talking about the war in Ukraine. The title today is obviously the war in Ukraine and the geopolitical changes that we are seeing. And we can talk a little bit about that, but especially around the implications for and in Africa. I've read a number of the articles that you wrote in the Daily Maverick in the lead-up. You've obviously been in the Ukraine now twice or even 3 times over the last couple of months. And one of the articles made reference to the threat that the war in the Ukraine has on liberal democracy, or our understanding of liberal democracy, especially for young democracies in Africa. I just want to also share 1 or 2 other pointers, and I might have the numbers slightly incorrect, but of the 193 countries that voted at the United Nations in early March, 141 of them voted to condemn Russia and called for an immediate withdrawal of Russia from the Ukraine. The 4 that were in support of Russia included Belarus, Eritrea, North Korea, and Syria. Bastions of democracy, some might say, yes, indeed. They stood with Russia. Then 35 abstained. Greg, without being too controversial, I was reading international media this weekend. A lot of the articles coming out of Project Syndicate, etc. And they said the most shocking countries that abstained from this were the likes of India and South Africa. Given our history, given our position on imperial rule, and obviously our values around liberal democracy. It is a very, very important thing. We are South Africans after all. I just wanted to share some of that with you. The other interesting part was, and this relates to the geopolitical consequences, especially for Africa. Are we seeing the end of globalization as we know it? Is this the end, or is it just the next phase of what we see? Those are just some questions just put in the back of your head. I know you've got a lot to share with us in this very short period of time, but those are some of the questions that I have at the outset of this discussion.
So, Lyal, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about some of my takeaways. And I think it's probably useful if I sort of frame them in four broad areas. And I think the first of these would be, what have we learned over the last 68 days in kind of operational terms, and then strategic terms in terms of the slightly wider picture, and then some of these geopolitical considerations, and then perhaps a fourth sort of in a PS to all of this is, what do I think might actually happen? And of course, none of us have a crystal ball. I don't possess a flux capacitor for my time machine, so I don't know what's going to happen, but I think you can make some sort of educated guess, and I'll attempt to do that. I mean, I think on the tactical or operational insights, in other words, the sort of military insights, I mean, I think that the first big takeaway out of this is how ineffective the Russians have been and how relatively effective the Ukrainians have been. I mean, offensive action, I did my PhD in counterinsurgency warfare, and the first principle of offensive action is that you require a concentration of applied force. And from pretty much day one of this operation, the Russians failed to concentrate their forces at the right places for the right amounts of time, as would be necessary to break through. And they might have expected that the Ukrainians would put up the same sort of show as they did in Crimea and in the Donbass in 2014. But it seemed also, unsurprisingly, that Kyiv had learned a lot of lessons from that conflict. They'd rearmed, they'd reorganized, and they have a unique advantage, I think, in that they understand the Russian mindset, having been part of the Russian-centered empire for many millennia. And they understand also the Western way of fighting, having really largely been incorporated into that world since the early 2000s. I think the second big takeaway is that there's been a lot of Western intelligence assistance, in addition to the weapons that you've seen on your television screens. I don't know the exact extent of Western intelligence assistance to Ukraine, but I think it'd be fair to assume that it's played a very big part in Ukrainian control of the battle space over air, sea, and land. And paradoxically or contrastingly, Russia's ability to win control over the intelligence domain has been surprisingly poor. And perhaps this reflects something more pervasive in the Russian system, in that those who live on fear are more likely to be misled by their commanders. So, if you live in a system where your commander is going to shoot the messenger, you tend to not be the person who wants to deliver the tough message. And that type of leadership also routinely, and this is in business as much as anything else, suppresses innovation, flexibility, and improvisation. And you see this time and time again in the Russian approach. And Russian intelligence, I think, has failed in all three phases of the war. The first phase was, of course, the attempt to quickly decapitate the Ukrainian leadership about a couple of hundred meters from where I currently sit. It didn't work in the second phase, which was the conventional phase to take Kyiv. And yesterday I was at the bridge in Irpin, where the Russian attack was stopped, and at the bridge which comes into Kyiv. And then, of course, they turned their attention to sort of grinding down these cities and static targets through massive aerial bombardments. And this is, again, I think, reminds of the imperative of telling leaders what they believe and not what they think that they want to hear. And I think that's a fundamental failing difference between the two systems. There's also, I think, a fair degree of evidence of the cost of corruption and the cost of institutional malaise. And I think you saw this in the long gridlocked lines of Russian convoys, which illustrates, if nothing else, the old saying by Omar Bradley that amateurs talk strategy and professionals talk logistics. And logistics rule battle spaces, they always do. And the Russian armed forces are in a very poor condition with regard to training and organization and equipment. And I think that reflects a failure, a widespread failure of governance and systemic corruption. As some would suggest, as much as a quarter of the defense procurement budget of Russia annually may have been pocketed over the last decade. I think you've also learned about the changing face of war. You know, we haven't perhaps moved very much in our way of thinking since the Second World War of mass tank formations. I saw on my long drive in from Lviv yesterday, it's some 700 kilometers, you know, the roadway, particularly outside Kyiv, dotted with blown up Russian tanks. And I think, you know, we've seen perhaps the limits of tank warfare if you've got a determined enemy and large numbers of relatively cheap and mobile anti-tank weapon systems. And the Ukrainians had, in this regard, a very interesting strategy that they took the decision very early on not to hold territory, but rather to absorb the invasion and then conduct hit and run attacks, what their commanders referred to as the mosquito strategy on stretched Russian supply lines. Another big lesson, I think, is the impact of command and control failures. The fact that so many senior Russian commanders have got killed is telling. It indicates logistics and other problems like communication, that the senior officers have been forced to move up to the front to find out what's happening. And the fact that the Russian communication was dependent on 3G, and that the Russians eliminated the Ukrainian 3G towers on the first days of the war, I think is consistent with this idea about levels of disorganization. So in terms of strategic insights, the sort of next bucket, you know, I think the big failing here for the Russians, although, you know, they talk of the war in terms of denazification, which is curious given Zelensky is Jewish, they really have lacked a clear and justifiable goal. I mean, their strategy was based on the idea that Ukraine is a pseudo-state riven with corruption, and these conditions would enable a rapid capitulation of the government and a victory, and the installation of one that's more favorable to Russia's interests, and this idea that Putin has of returning to the territories of the Soviet Union to one single formation was part and parcel of this dream. But what he's done, of course, is he's ensured that the Ukrainians have pulled together with greater unity than ever before in their 30 years of formal statehood, and of course their several thousand years of informal statehood. He also very badly misread a second factor, which is Western political resolve. And you might remember that in February, Putin described the West as an empire of lies. And I think that he acutely miscalculated what this conflict would do in Europe, not least in terms of the sanctions which have followed and the long-term impact on the Russian economy, so dependent as it is on oil and gas. Very interestingly, the Russians had championed a strategy, sort of so-called hybrid war strategy, which was essentially an asymmetric war using non-military and military elements, and involved, you know, cyber aspects, fake news, lots of bots usage, and so on, as part of a wider program of political destabilization. And this is what they've done very effectively. It's what the Russians were alleged to be involved in South Africa, of course, during the state capture period. And I think one of the interesting things about this is that they haven't really pursued this strategy. They've gone conventional very quickly. They've been unable to secure control of cyberspace, and they've not been able to shut down Ukraine's counter narrative to this, which of course has been led by President Zelensky, who has been something of a political genius And very few Ukrainians would have thought that at the start of the conflict. He was the comedian who became the sort of accidental president, but he has now led the country quite remarkably and has become a kind of benchmark for the type of leadership that many people in the world want to see. So the Russians almost have had their sort of attempt to craft a political narrative turned against them. And they haven't been able to then have themselves a convincing narrative. And at the contemporary battlefield, at a strategic level today, is really a transparent backdrop to leadership, where you use media to make all the difference. And despite the existence of RT and Sputnik and the use of informal media, social media, including Twitter, outside of its borders, Russia has, I think, quickly lost the battle for public opinion, although it may be slowly regaining some of this ground. But it quickly lost this battle, very interestingly, because it was shown to be untruthful. Right up until the invasion, when the West was saying, you're going to invade, Lavrov and others, the foreign minister, was saying, no, we're not going to invade. We're just conducting military exercises in Belarus. And so from the very beginning, the Russian narrative in this process was undermined. And I think it's a reminder, again, in business as much as anything else, is, the cost of telling porky pies is actually your credibility. And the Russians have faced an enormous credibility gap, whereas Western credibility was, I think, enhanced on the back of a massive damage done in Afghanistan, was enhanced by the fact that they were able to pinpoint the day of the invasion almost to the moment. And that's been very important. So let me just turn to the third area then, which is sort of geopolitical insights. And the point that Lyal made early on, which is there is a very contested global narrative out there. Now, governments representing about 60% of the world's population, including India and South Africa and much of the Middle East, don't accept the Ukrainian or Western narrative for various reasons. And I think these reasons include self-interest, particularly self-interest of elites in the case of South Africa, but also perceptions of a Western double standard. And that this war doesn't really involve us, we don't want to have any part of it. And the irony, of course, and there are many ironies here, the very basis for South Africa's own political struggle 3 decades ago, very paralleling that of Ukraine, was all about rights and freedoms and democracy and the rule of law. And it's interesting to see that countries which came to power on these basic principles, and where the basic principles protect those in power, are wavering in their support for them and prefer to sort of take please don't bother us with these things, we've got our own problems to deal with type of point of view, and particularly don't want to be seen to be a stooge of the West. And I think this might provide still opportunities for further exploitation by Russia and China, but it might more positively also provide some basis on which you could locate peace negotiations. And I think China in particular, as a peace broker, is hugely critical here, because I do believe one of the Chinese goals in all of this is to insert themselves into a peace process in Europe and become part of the political economy of Europe over the longer term. Three things. One, he's shown how weak his army is, but he's also, he's managed to get the Germans to spend money on defense. Not even President Trump was able to do that, and strengthen NATO. But he's also killed COVID. So at least we have him to thank for something. But, the strengthening of the West and the unification of NATO and an emboldened and strengthened Taiwan would certainly for China seem to be bad things. But, this is going to be balanced against Russian economic and political dependency and the possibility of Chinese deal making. And I would say on balance that one of the big winners of this is going to be Xi Jinping and the Chinese. Obviously, they don't want this to drag on for a long time, given the global political, economic implications of it. So I would imagine that they're going to extract very onerous terms from Russia. And I'm sure that the Russians and the Chinese are going to probably like each other even less as a consequence of this, rather than like each other more over the longer term. I think thirdly, there's questions about the political cost of failure. I mean, the Russians have gone to a next phase of the war, which is to try and link up the forces in the east and then create a land bridge with Crimea. And I think you'll see on the 9th of May, which is Armed Forces Day in Russia, I suspect you'll see an announcement by Putin that they will try and link up with Russian separatists or Russian nationalists in Moldova. And that will endanger, I think, further Odessa. I mean, he may on the 9th of May signal that this is no longer a special military operation, but instead a fully fledged war. And then, all bets are off, but we'll have to wait and see what he has in mind. But I suspect that what he wants to do is basically cut off Ukraine from the sea, at least as far as Crimea and potentially also Odessa. But if he doesn't do this, if the Ukrainians have sufficient weaponry flown in, particularly heavy weaponry, artillery, guided artillery systems from the West, and that stuff is arriving all the time, he'll have to explain, Putin will have to explain to his people why they've incurred significant losses and why they look incompetent. And of course, there are many traditional rivalries in Russia, which we don't see in this current kind of czarist, Putin-esque environment, but they're traditional rivalries between the military and the intelligence service, which may play out in such a scenario. But it is difficult to see, I think, wholesale changes in the internal situation in Russia, partly because Russians have swallowed Putin's version of history. They seem to believe in it. He still remains popular, but the cost to Putin at some point may be too great for others to bear. And this is going to depend on how his subordinates in the military react. Of course, Russia's lost significant numbers of soldiers. Russia lost 14,400 people in Afghanistan in the 1980s. If Western sources are to be believed, it's lost at least that number in Ukraine already in 2 months. Photographic evidence is at least of the loss of 600 tanks. The Ukrainians say as many as 2,000. They say 23,000 Russian troops. Even if you take the Western numbers, they're very high. And Russia no longer has the 3.5 million troops that it had during the height of the Cold War. It really has an army of 280,000 people, and it's already committed the best part of 200,000 to this conflict. So it's going to probably have to do a general mobilization if it wants to go to the next stage. And that indeed is one of the things that's going to possibly happen on the 9th of May. But the effect on morale would be devastating already in terms of what has happened, in terms of the losses. In other geopolitical insights, obviously the big one for Africa is the 3 Fs, food, fuel, and fertilizer. Ukraine is the world's #1 sunflower, #3 corn, and #5 ranked wheat supplier worldwide. And the war is not going to only affect its own income, but food security. It supplies about 16% of the world's corn exports, about a fifth of rapeseed, half of sunflower, 12% of honey exports, big chicken supplier as well. And its contribution to the global food system feeds more than 400 million people, excluding the 45 million Ukrainians. Asia is a big importer, and you've seen big price rises in Asia. Fertilizers, of course, being notable by over 40% given the Russian impact. And that's probably going to push more self-reliance in Asia. And of course, the increase in transport costs as a consequence of this. The problems for Ukraine are really not really about production, because most of the areas under cultivation have not been affected by the conflict. They're going to cultivate about 90% of those areas that they already had under cultivation in 2021. But it's really about export. They need to export about 5 to 6 million tons of grain a month. And currently they can do about 10% of this figure. And that's really sending stuff through Poland up into Gdansk. And they don't have the rail connection over the border to enable that. If they can get that fixed, then you'll see greater volumes coming out. And I suspect that's an infrastructure priority for them. But it certainly is a big challenge currently. And the roads are hugely congested here with trucks as a consequence of this. And this is going to have a particularly negative impact for certain African countries. I mean, Ethiopia, which is in a conflict all of its own, it depends on Ukraine for more than a third of its wheat supplies. And you're dealing with very poor markets with very big export demands, and with less than half of Africa's 55 countries being net food exporters, there's a disproportionate impact on Africa on food security. And then finally, let me just a couple of last comments on how it might end. I mean, I think that the West, it reflects to a degree Western resolve. I think the West has proven to be a formidable adversary in this regard. Whether they ramp up sanctions, particularly oil and gas sanctions, which have been promised, the Germans are going to, say a couple of months and oil sanctions will be applied. Gas is going to take a little longer, but you're already seeing this, alternative measures being taken. I think some countries, Turkey notable in this, have maintained a very kind of schizophrenic view. They're critical of Russia. They sell arms to Ukraine, particularly those drones, but they at the same time continue to do business with Russia because it's an important player in everything from tourism to energy provision. But there's, I think, Western resolve to keep doing this, although to an extent, the West has a limited attention span. And I would suspect by the end of this year, we will probably have, forgotten that Ukraine was at war. And I think the Ukrainians realize that and have to keep that narrative alive internationally. They will continue to try and isolate Russia diplomatically and in the media. And I think certainly the evidence of human rights attacks, and I'm going to butcher in a moment, evidence of the human rights atrocities that have occurred, and we haven't even begun to understand fully what's happened in a city like Mariupol. This is going to have a significant impact on Russia's global standing. And I do think the upcoming series of battles, these battles for the land bridge between the East and Crimea, and potentially between Crimea and Moldova, this is going to, I think, determine whether Ukraine is going to be left partitioned. Now, every Ukrainian you speak to says they're going to win, of course, but of course, Putin equally is trying to rescue some sort of victory from his apparent defeat. I think whatever happens, Ukraine is going to emerge from this still in control of 85% of its land area, an independent state, and emboldened with its own democratic government. And that's certainly from a strategic perspective, a very large defeat for Putin. Of course, if he can carve out those territories and limit continuously, not just through naval blockades, Ukrainian access to the sea, then of course he has a bigger victory to claim, Mr. Putin. But of course that has severe consequences for Africa because of the export of grains and foodstuffs. So I think one of the first things that African diplomacy should be calling for is to is to internationalize the control of Odessa, so at least we can start exporting foodstuffs and get everything settled down in terms of international food markets as quickly as possible. And I think fundamentally and lastly, absent a peace deal satisfactory to the Ukrainians, this war is likely to drag on as long as Putin is in charge in Russia. So even if he declares victory from, in the east and in the southeast, and then uses a couple of years to regroup, he'll be back at it again. So there has to be a peace deal that is satisfactory to both sides. The Ukrainians currently lack any sort of offensive capacity or the offensive capacity that they'll need to remove them. And if they don't, then this could become a long war of attrition, which would suit neither side. But also very importantly, and I'll just circle back to this, it would also not suit China at all. So I would say that one would expect increasingly that the Chinese start flexing muscles over Ukraine, probably clandestinely more than anything else, but in putting some pressure on, the sort of pressure that's necessary for a peace agreement to take place. So let me end there. Just some brief thoughts on Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Greg. And while we just go through some of the points that you've raised, or some of the themes, I just want to appeal to the audience. Don't be shy. I know you're all out there. Please fire away some questions. You can go onto the chat line, or you can send questions on the Q&A bar on the bottom, which both Dale and I will field, and we'll read them out to Greg. So please think of fire them away, and let's not worry too much about that. One or two of the things that, and we only have another 10 minutes or so that's why I'm saying get your questions in there before we actually end the discussion. Greg's obviously in the Ukraine at the moment. I'm going to ask you a little bit about your movements, and if you are allowed to or able to divulge where you're going to be traveling around to, Greg, because I know that you're not just seeing Kyiv, you're also going to other parts of the country. But one or two of the the points that you've raised, which we have not heard a lot about. Obviously, from the West, we have a kind of a biased perspective of the news media coming through, and we have heard a lot about this limited attention span that the West has, and how Putin was quite effective in interpreting this. So that was an interesting point that you raised in around how it might all end, and where Putin has actually been shown up through this. I do think that a lot of the things, like you said, Putin has done a lot for NATO in terms of increasing the spend, especially from countries like Germany. It's killed COVID, and it's flagged certain issues around geopolitics with Taiwan and China. But the other thing that it's done is it's resulted in much of the world forgetting about kind of the cold standoff between the United States and China. And I do think that what you've highlighted around China becoming pivotal through this is quite different to what I've read. And I really do appreciate that, especially from what I've read around what China's role might be in peacekeeping and maybe elevating its role in the global economy. One last point that I've just thought about was around the implications for Africa, the 3 Fs, food, fuel, and fertilizer, all extremely important in the rise and the development of Africa. That's what most people on this call are interested in. And obviously, as you did mention, a large portion or a large majority of African countries are net food importers. We often forget about that, by the way. And they're importing food from the likes of Ukraine. The Middle East also is a massive food importer from the Ukraine. I was reading the IMF's updates. The IMF has revised its growth updates just last week. Latin America is only going to be growing by 2.5%. And let's not forget that Latin America is an alternative to much of what is produced in Russia and Eastern Europe or the Ukraine. But they too are going to be downgrading their growth rates. Africa doesn't replace much of that, which is quite interesting. So the outlook for Africa and the economic implications are quite severe, and probably a lot more severe than what we might have thought about at the outset. Those are just some of my high-level takeaways at this stage. We have a question. I'm going to hand over to Dale to field the question, Greg, if you don't mind.
Cool. Yeah, Greg, so Gareth asked, how long would you expect the economic activity to return to normality, in inverted commas, post the conflict, should it end? I guess.
Sure. I mean, it depends how long it goes on. You know, there's a sad axiom in for people like me who study conflict and who occasionally get involved in them, but is that the period of decline of recovery is normally as long as the period of decline. And certainly the period of rebuilding, I think, in Ukraine is going to be enormous. You know, you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, Ukraine is a $165 billion economy. It's currently running a monthly deficit of $6 billion. So, you know, it has to plug that gap. Aid is going to make some difference to that. But, you know, all the infrastructure damage that's gone on, this is going to take some time to repair all those facilities that have been broken by this, places like Mariupol, which, you know, look like Stalingrad. So that's Ukraine in a kind of micro sense. Obviously, in terms of the global economy, you've got other factors to consider, particularly around sanctions. Now, Russia's, you know, really an oil and gas economy and a commodity-based economy. You know, whether others plug into that market and reduce those costs, you see an increase in production elsewhere, or, you know, a greater acceleration towards energy diversification. These would, I think, mitigate the consequences of this. I'm always surprised, though, to Gareth's question, is how quickly things recover. I mean, you know, how quickly people do workarounds and how quickly people bounce back. Now, that may not be the case in Russia. I mean, you know, the global economy and Russia, perhaps two separate things in this regard. And I think we often forget that Russia is, you know, on the one hand, it has, you know, capabilities of putting people into space. On the other, you know, 25% of its people live in homes without running water. So, you know, I think it was Lyndon Baines Johnson, don't hold me to this, but who described Russia in the 1960s as upper Volta with nuclear weapons. So, you know, it is a very basic economy, and it's one that has, you know, all sorts of challenges in this regard, and these are going to be compounded by the effects of sanctions. So, in terms of economic recovery, I think there's been the shock factor, and I think the bounce back will be, I imagine, fairly quick, partly because Russia is a fairly small player in this, but this is going to depend on whether we can, you know, find alternative sources in terms of commodities. I'm particularly worried, as Lyal has intimated, about the effects of commodity price increases in places like in North and West Africa and the Horn of Africa. Already, you know, conflict economies in some places like Ethiopia, where you've got, you know, per capita incomes of the sort of 600, 700, 800 annual margins, very little in the way of safety nets, and suddenly you've got 30-40% price increases in this, and in basic foodstuffs, in breads, in cooking oil, and those are going to, I think, have a negative security impact. And so I think we have to watch out for this in the Sahel, whether you're going to see pressures, and even pressures in South Africa, given our own experience in July last year. You know, are there going to be violent protests if you suddenly see prices of things like cooking oil go up, which are going to be inevitable? And I think the prices are already going up. So, yeah, global economic recovery and, you know, how societies manage the impacts of this, I think, are probably two related but separate questions.
Yeah. So, Greg, the point around the rise in food prices, and obviously it's a major setback. We spoke a lot about what the pandemic did to African development, and there's some studies that are coming out now. Obviously, the war is resulting in a dramatic rise in food prices for some of the countries that are struggling. You made mention of Ethiopia, and I know that you've done quite a lot of work there. It's interesting, just yesterday I was listening to the food price increases in South Africa. Cooking oil is increasing by as much as about 50% over the last few months. Even apples, if those of you that are eating apples at this stage, those are increasing by over 30%. And then the only ones that are down are perhaps tomatoes and those types of things, but they're basic foodstuffs. And that, as you rightly mentioned, results in certain areas of upheavals and and what we saw last year in South Africa. But the rest of Africa is probably more crucial at this quick period of time. Greg, there's a very interesting question that comes in from William Croxton, and it also relates to a great deal of interest, or what Putin has done to pique the interest of people in Russia, Russian society, Russian leadership. But he asks, does Putin's inner circle believe the propaganda that appears on the state media, or are they aware of what is happening on the ground? Could this lead to Putin being overthrown? And he makes mention of, especially due to the fact that his health seems to be suspect. Very, very interesting, because obviously Putin has come to represent this enigma, you know, the old riddle within an enigma type thing. Russia never before has been more so a riddle within an enigma, but also led by an enigma himself. So maybe you want to just speak to what Russians are interpreting this, and do they believe their own state media?
Well, the honest answer is we don't really know. If you look at the opinion polls, he seems to remain very popular because they fed a diet of particular types of news. I had a great late night exchange with a Ukrainian who actually fought in the Russian army in Afghanistan, so we had something in common. But and he eventually said, after a long evening, he said eventually Russians will have to choose between the television and the refrigerator. And what he meant by that, they'll have to choose between the propaganda that they hear on the TV and what they have in their refrigerator to eat. And he said to me, and rather acutely said, and you can't eat a television. So, at some point, Russians will realize that this has costs. But, Russians are very stoic, and if they think it's, in the interests of the longer term, that they will stick with it. I think a bigger impact is going to be on body bags. The Russians have kept very quiet their casualty numbers. Have admitted to about 1,800 people being killed so far. And one of the big impacts of the war in Ukraine was, the war in Afghanistan, was people coming back in body bags. And as I said, that was 14,400 people, and you've already, if the estimates are to be believed, you've already gone past that figure in Ukraine. So that is going to start having an impact in a world that's interconnected much more so than it was back in the 1980s. So I'm not sure if he's going to remain that popular if people are hungry and they know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody's child got killed in Ukraine, fighting a war which, if you believe Mr. Putin, is against the people who are the same as you. So it starts to have a very confusing logic as a consequence of this. I do think that that Putin is at some point going to have to find something around which he declares victory and can go away and lick his wounds for a while. And it's just finding that point. Although whether he escalates because a wounded Putin, maybe people, try and surmise that he may be more dangerous than a strong Putin. But in terms of what his people are thinking around him, I don't think really anybody really knows even what Mr. Putin's thinking, and because he seems to be so isolated. And at some point, the oligarchs themselves are going to be a bit unhappy because their ATM cards don't work anymore, and their super yachts are, tied to the quayside and we're in Monaco, wherever it is. So they're going to be a bit grumpy. But whether this translates into widespread disapproval from Mr. Putin, I think is going to be dependent on broader economic issues.
So, Greg, I know that we've gone a little bit over time, and you have a relatively busy agenda ahead of you today. So I'm not going to take too much of your time. There's just one or two quick questions. Tammy Jackson asks an interesting one. Again, looking into your crystal ball, do you believe that South Africa will change their stance and or to not get involved, as she says, should the impact on us increase? I mean, you made reference to that. And then I've got one final one as we end off, but maybe if you want to just make quick mention of those foreign policy positions that South Africa has taken.
I don't see us changing our position. Unfortunately, I think we have a kind of foreign policy position where we seem to be unable to to see things in anything other than bipolar terms. So we tend to see things as black and white. We're for you or against you. We were like that on Zimbabwe. And I think what South Africa lacks is a sort of, pardon the expression, shades of gray in its foreign policy response. What we should do is be critical, say that it's wrong, because indeed it is wrong. I mean, you don't go around invading other countries because you want to recreate an empire, and the empire has a terrible resonance too in Africa. So, and we are here for reasons of democracy and supporting those basic values. So you can actually be critical, but also play a role. But what we've done is we've cozied up and not been critical. And I think probably in so doing have certainly have tarnished our image of neutrality and that the levers of power that we have in the international community, which relate to our history and the nature of our transition. So I don't unfortunately see us as changing our position, although I wish we would, and do something like Turkey's done or Israel has done, which is to be critical, but also, and to vote against Russia, but also to say, we're open to mediate. And we're open to mediate precisely because we do think we do see this in negative terms. What we have done is I think we've made it very difficult for ourselves to play a constructive mediation role in many conflicts because we are unable just to say when things are wrong.
I think you raise a very interesting point, Greg, which does challenge some of those who have written about and advocate and supported South Africa's position here in South Africa, is that you kind of have to be in the tent to be able to have an impact on what's going on, and you can be in the tent and maybe pass criticism or participate in that way, especially for a country that has really embraced not only liberal democracy, but a multipolar world, and that always championed multilateralism. It's a very, very strange position that we have taken. I want to end my questions, or from the audience, Franco Bauer apologies for the pronunciation, but has raised an interesting one, and it's on a positive note. Not to downplay how bad things are, Franco says, but are there any positives that will come from this? And I think this is a good question, because maybe it's going to push us in the direction of an Elon Musk or something like that for renewable energies or whatever. I don't know, maybe on the geopolitical side of things, you did allude to how this will maybe produce or nurture the rise of a new Ukraine, of a new style of liberal democracy, perhaps, because as you and I both know, this is also something that has come under a great deal of criticism, is these old constructs of liberal democracy and capitalism, etc. So maybe some positive thoughts that might come out of this, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned one, which is more energy diversification. I think a stronger sense of values. I mean, Europe is not a geographic concept; it's a concept of values. And every 10 years there's a struggle in Ukraine about what it wants to be. Does it want to look east, look west? And every 10 years they're reminded they want to be European. And the people want to have these values and enjoy the prosperity that goes with them. And I think that what this has been is, I think, a big boost for liberal democracy. I think it's been a big boost for trade and other openness, and it's been a big boost for those who hold these sorts of values, dearly. But I also think that it's kind of exposed some countries as being, perhaps possessing a facade of such values. And unfortunately, I think to an extent, South Africa has been among them. That we've tried to sort of hedge our bets, and that you wouldn't want to be with countries that are about, that are not invading others, that have, enshrines sovereign protection, the rule of law and democracy and these sorts of things, I think does raise big question marks. So maybe it's a fork in the road. That's another way of looking at it. Doesn't mean you can't cut back at some point or reverse, as we incline to do on our freeways down the road the wrong way. and get back on the other fork. I think Europe's use of sanctions, I think, has been also a big departure point. It's meant it's sort of back on the agenda in international relations. And if you're a wannabe authoritarian, or an authoritarian, you must be a little concerned that these could be used against you, particularly third-party sanctions. In other words, that you're operating in one country means that you're now sanctioned in another as a consequence of this, places like Zimbabwe. These are things to watch out for. A tougher sanctions regime globally, tougher international criminal court regime globally. I mean, that's a big question. Does multilateralism, does the UN, which appears to be completely useless in the struggle, does it emerge stronger or weaker as a consequence of this? Do we ultimately then realize we have to strengthen these systems, that they are fundamentally flawed by having a UN Security Council where one of the chief protagonists in this regard can veto anything of purpose? Does it mean that these structures have to finally be reformed 70 years after they were created? I think these are big questions. So, and they may well be answered positively. So like everything in life, I tend to look at the glass as being half full. And I do see that there will be green shoots politically, green shoots in terms of European expansionism. Will Poland be the next, will Ukraine be the next Poland? I think is the question on everybody's lips. I suspect it will be in time. As a big new growth economy, people here are very impressive, well-trained, and so on. And what does this mean for the future configuration of Europe and indeed of Russia itself? Ukraine's the second largest country in Europe. Russia's, of course, the largest. So, is this the beginning of the end of the type of rule that we have become accustomed to in Russia? And in a sense, this is the, maybe as Francis Fukuyama put it, 30 years too early. Now, is this really the end of history or the beginning of the end of history? And that we're all moving inexorably towards these liberal systems. So I tend to look at this as a unfortunate and tragic, but perhaps inevitable step, and ultimately a positive event in the broader sweep of history.
Thanks, Greg. It's a great way to end, and I agree. It's an interesting, it's an unfortunate and a tragic catalyst for us to rethink and reimagine and maybe refresh things that required that, and that's where perhaps even the pandemic did something quite similar. So having a double whammy of these does actually make us rethink, refresh, and reform what is necessary. Dale, have you got any other questions before we end off, or any other comments?
No, I know Greg's run seriously over, so really appreciate you dialing in, Greg, and sharing your thoughts. You can run. I mean, I think we can edit there, although I mean, I think, Lyal, if you want to, so Greg, don't mind if you log out.
We know you
really appreciate.
We know you have a full agenda.
Cool. He's logged out.
Okay, there you go.
I just wanted, Rob, we've got 3 minutes. I thought I'd use the time. I think that was absolutely fascinating. A lot of insights, I think, and questions that are coming up now. I think people, everybody on the call, please, if you do have questions, drop us a line. We can certainly try and answer them. If we haven't answered them today, we will share the different books that Greg has written, some of the YouTube links perhaps, as well as the articles he writes in the Daily Maverick, and he's a regular contributor on radio as well. Rob did ask a question here around sanctions. Lyal, I'm not sure if you want to take a stab.
So Rob Ferguson, sorry, we didn't get to this, but he did actually touch on or Greg Mills touched on the sanctions question. I think it's just gone off the screen there. Can you just go?
Oh, sorry, man.
Sorry about that. Sorry, Rob. Got it back here. How long does it generally take to walk back sanctions to open trade with Russia? It's very difficult to say that because sanctions are so widely criticized because they kind of non-discriminative in many respects. But Greg did make mention of this, and he in terms of his recovery response. Will sanctions on Russia stay in place for a medium to long term, regardless of the war, if the war ends tomorrow? I would probably argue that because of the growing division around the use of sanctions, they won't stay in place if the war ends literally tomorrow. But having said that, the West might use sanctions to put in place a system that is more palatable to the West. this is just my perspective, but I do also think that it's in the world's interests, and not only the world, but the citizens of the world, and obviously Russia, that sanctions do end. But what we did see, and Greg made reference to this, is not only his reference to NATO and the increase in spend in NATO, but what is very, very interesting is how Europe has come together, how Europe has united in this position, and especially around sanctions. And I think that's going to be an important one to watch in terms of getting coming to an understanding around Rob's question.
Awesome.
Good.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. I know we're pretty much out of time. I think that was fascinating. As a reminder, on the 17th of May, we're going to have a fascinating session on new metrics for progress in Africa, measuring what counts in a changing context. So, given COVID and today's discussion, how do we look at things differently? Who has handled, which countries have handled the pandemic well, etc. And then on the 24th of May, we'll be talking maybe a little bit about the positive impact. What are some of the emerging risks, but therefore emerging opportunities, particularly in the specialty area in Africa. If people are able to stay on for 1 minute, Dion just has made a comment here of concern to me is the lack of news coverage from the opposite side. It's conspicuous by its absence. How can we make conclusions in sense of this if we are not fully informed? It's a good point. I know we were talking about this before the session. Yeah.
What I would suggest, Dion, and I think it's a fantastic question, and I alluded to this again with Greg, is that we seem to be, despite our opening up of media, social media especially, and in fact, social media can be dangerous at times in terms of echo chambers that we create for ourselves. But I do think it's useful and we've got access to Russian state media. But we see this division in media, even in the United States, with Fox News versus MSNBC or CNN. So it's a very interesting one. My suggestion is try and read as much as what you can, or watch as much as what you can. It's pretty well covered across different YouTube channels, etc. And then and also often look at what the analysis is. So sources like the Atlantic, even if you're here in South Africa, the Daily Maverick carries quite a diversity of views as well. And South Africa, incidentally, has been carrying an interesting diversity. I don't always necessarily agree with many of the views, but it's interesting to read and sometimes enlightening to read a view that is contrary to your own. But I think the facts are difficult to come by in times of war. And I would also then look a lot at the analysis coming out of Project Syndicate, the Atlantic and others. And if you are interested in more information on this, Dale and I can certainly send you a few links and share some of those. I think it's an interesting exercise to create a conversation around this if this is something of interest. Yeah. I do think it's going to have a massive impact on all of us, especially operating across Africa. Greg didn't touch on it extensively enough, but Ethiopia is potentially going to be one of the real hotspots going forward, as we've seen back in 2020, 2021. And we are very, very concerned about that, because this could be another famine that comes from an external force, an externality which nobody could have anticipated. So this is something that I'm very, very concerned about in terms of the Horn of Africa as well, and the stability that we're trying to reach in many countries across the continent.
Brilliant. Great stuff. Thanks, everybody. I think that was fascinating. I think that was a record audience. If so, that's amazing. So thank you for your time. And look forward to seeing you all next Tuesday. Great.
See you soon, guys.
Thanks, everyone.